Hegel's Phenomenology Spirit, Reason, Observing Reason. Observation of nature continued. We see then that the moments of the organic inner, taken by themselves, are incapable of furnishing the aspects of a law of being, since in such a law they are asserted of an outer existence, are distinguished from one another, and neither aspect could be equally named in place of the other. Further, that placed on one side, they do not find in the other side their realization in a fixed system, for this latter would be as little possess any organic truth, that is, the truth of organic being, as it would be the expression of those moments of the organic inner. The essential nature of organic being, since it is in itself the universal, rather consists in general in its moments being equally universal in actual existence, that is, in their being pervasive processes, but not in giving an image of the universal in an isolated thing. In this way, the idea of a law, in the case of organic being, is altogether lost. The law wants to grasp and express the antithesis as inert aspects, and in them the determinateness, which is their relation to one another, the inner to which the manifested universality belongs, and the outer to which belong the parts of the inert shape, were supposed to constitute the corresponding aspects of the law, but as thus held apart, they lose their organic significance, and what lies at the base of the idea of law is precisely this, that each of its two aspects should have an independent, indifferent subsistence of its own, the relation of the aspects being shared between them as a twofold determinateness corresponding to that relation. The fact is that each aspect of the organism is its own self, just this, to be a simple universality in which all determinations are dissolved, and to be the movement of this process. An insight into the difference between the way of formulating a law and previous forms will make its nature perfectly clear. If, namely, we look back to the movement of perceiving and to that of the understanding, in which the latter reflects itself into itself and thereby determines its object, we see that the understanding does not in that movement have before itself in its object the relation of these abstract determinations of universal and individual, essential and external. It is itself the transition which does not become objective to it. Here, on the contrary, the organic unity, which is just the relation of these opposites, this relation being a pure transition, is itself the object. This transition, in its simplicity, is immediately universality, and since the universality explicates the different moments, whose relation is to express the law, its moments are universal objects of this consciousness, and the law runs, the outer is the expression of the inner. Here the understanding has grasped the thought of the law itself, whereas previously it only looked for laws generally, and their moments were only vaguely present to it as a specific content, but not as the thoughts of the laws. As regards content, the laws obtained here ought not to be such as are merely a passive taking up into the form of universality of simply inert differences, but laws which directly possess in these differences the unrest of the notion, and consequently at the same time possess the necessity of the relation between the aspects. But just because the object, the organic unity, directly unites the infinite supersession or absolute negation of being with inert being, and because the moments are essentially a pure transition, there are no such inert aspects as are required for the law. In order to obtain such aspects, the understanding must keep to the other moment of the organic relationship, namely to the reflectedness of organic existence into itself. But this being is so completely reflected into itself that there is no determinateness, relation to something else left over for it. Immediate sensuous being is immediately one with the determinateness as such, and therefore expresses a qualitative difference in that being, e.g. blue as against red, acid as against alkali, and so on. But organic being that has returned into itself is completely indifferent towards another. Its existence is a simple universality, and it denies to observation any lasting sensuous differences, or, what is the same thing, displays its essential determinateness only as the flux of inert determinateness. Consequently, The way in which difference, qua inert, expresses itself is just this, that it is an indifferent difference, that is, difference as magnitude. In this, however, the notion is extinguished and necessity has vanished, but then the content and filling of this indifferent being, the flux of sensuous determinations, gathered up into an organic determination, expresses also this, that the content really does not have that determinateness, namely that of the immediate property, and the qualitative element falls solely in the determination of magnitude, as we saw above. Although then the objective aspect, which is apprehended as an organic determinateness, itself contains the notion and is thereby distinguished from the object as it presents itself to the understanding, which, in apprehending the content of its laws, behaves purely as perception, yet apprehension in the first case relapses completely into the principle and the manner of the understanding that merely perceives. For by so doing, what is apprehended receives the character of a fixed determinateness, the form of an immediate property of an inert phenomenon. Furthermore, it is subsumed under the category of quantity, and the nature of the notion is suppressed. The exchange of an object that is merely perceived for one reflected into itself, of a merely sensuous determinateness for an organic one, thus loses once more its value, and does so by the fact that the understanding has not yet put behind it the formulating of laws. To illustrate this exchange by some examples, we may find perhaps that something which perception takes to be an animal with strong muscles is defined as an animal organism of high irritability, or what perception takes to be a condition of great weakness is defined as a condition of high sensibility, or, if we prefer it, as an abnormal affection and moreover a raising of it to a higher potency, expressions which translate sensuous facts into Latin, and a bad Latin at that, instead of into the notion. That an animal has strong muscles may also be expressed by the understanding by saying that the animal possesses a great muscular force, great weakness meaning a similarity, a slight force. Determination in terms of irritability has this advantage over determination in terms of force, that the latter expresses indeterminate, but the former determinate reflection into self, for the force peculiar to muscle is precisely irritability, and irritability is a preferable determination to strong muscles, since as in force reflection into self is already directly implied in it. Similarly, weakness of slight force, organic passivity, is given determinate expression in terms of sensibility, but when this sensibility is so taken by itself and fixed, and in addition is bound up with quantitative determination, and qua greater or less sensibility, is opposed to a greater or less irritability. Each is wholly in the element of sense, and is reduced to the ordinary form of a property. What connects them is not the notion, but on the contrary, a quantitative antithesis, which becomes a difference lacking any thought content. Though the indefiniteness of the expression force, strength, and weakness was thereby eliminated, there now arises the equally futile, vague floundering about between the antithesis of higher and lower sensibility and irritability as they increase and decrease relatively to one another. The determinations of greater or lesser sensibility or irritability are no less the unthinking apprehension and expression of a sensuous phenomenon than are the wholly sensuous determinations of strength and weakness, which are devoid of any thought content. Those thoughtless expressions have not been replaced by the notion. Instead, strength and weakness have been given a determination which, taken solely by itself, is based on the notion which it has for its content, but loses completely this origin and character. On account of the form of simplicity and immediacy in which this content is made into the aspect of a law, and because quantity constitutes the element of difference in such determinations, the essence of the content, which originally is the notion and is posited as such, retains the mode of sense perception and remains as far removed from being cognized as when determined in terms of strength and weakness or by immediate sense properties. Now, there still remains to be considered solely on its own account what the outer aspect of organic being is, and how in it the antithesis of its inner and outer is determined, just as at first the inner of the whole in relation to its own outer was considered. The outer, considered by itself, is the structured shape in general, the system of life articulating itself in the element of being and at the same time essentially the being for another of the organism, objective being in being for self. This other appears in the first instance as its outer inorganic nature. If these two are considered in relation to a law, the inorganic nature cannot, as we saw above, constitute the aspect of a law over against the organism, because the latter is at the same time absolutely for itself and has a universal and free relation to inorganic nature. To define more precisely, however, the relationship of these two aspects in the organic shape, this shape is in one respect turned against its inorganic nature, while in the other it is for itself and reflected into itself. The actual organism is the middle term, which unites the being for self of life with the outer in general and with being in itself. The extreme of being for self is, however, the inner as an infinite one which takes back into itself out of their subsistence and connection with outer nature the moments of shape itself. It is that which, without a content of its own, gives itself a content in its shape and appears in shape as its process. In this extreme, where it is a simple negativity or a pure singular, the organism possesses its absolute freedom in virtue of which it is indifferent towards and secured against being for other, and the determinateness of the moments of shape. This freedom is at the same time freedom of the moments themselves. It is their possibility of appearing as an outer existence and of being apprehended as such, and just as in this freedom they are free and indifferent towards this outer existence, so too are they in relation to one another. For the simplicity of this freedom is being, or is their simple substance. This notion of pure freedom is one and the same life. No matter how many and varied its shapes or its being for other, it is a matter of indifference to the stream of life what kind of mills it drives. Now, in the first place, it is to be noted that this notion is not to be understood here as it was formerly when we were considering the properly inner in its form of process, or the development of its moments, but in its form of a simple inner, which constitutes the purely universal aspect in contrast to the actual living being, or as the element in which the existent members of the organic shape have their subsistence. For it is this shape that we are considering here, and in it the essence of life is present as a simplicity of subsistence. In the next place, the being for other, or the determinateness of the actual structured shape, is taken up into the simple universality which is its essence, a determinateness which is equally simple, universal, and non-sensuous, and can only be that which is expressed in number. The determinateness is the middle term of the shape which links indeterminate life with the actual life, simple like the former and determinate like the latter. That which in the former, the inner, would be expressed numerically, the outer would have to express in accordance with its mode as a multiform actuality, namely as its manner of life, colour, etc. in general, as the entire host of differences which are developed in the world of appearance. If the two aspects of the organic whole, the one being the inner, while the other is the outer, in such a way that each again has its own self, an inner and an outer, are compared with reference to the inner which each aspect has, then the inner of the first aspect was the notion as the unrest of abstraction. The second, however, has for its inner a quiescent universality, which also involves a quiescent determinateness, number. If therefore the first inner, because the notion develops its moments in it, made a deceptive promise of laws on account of the show of necessity in the relationship, the second directly disclaims doing so, since number shows itself to be the determination of one aspect of its laws for number is just that completely quiescent, lifeless, and indifferent determinateness in which all movement and relation is extinguished, and which has broken the bridge to the living element of instincts, manner of life, and other aspects of sensuous existence. But to consider the shape of the organism as such, and the inner qua inner, merely of the shape, is in fact no longer to consider organic being, for the two aspects which were supposed to be related are posited as merely indifferent towards each other, with the result that the reflection into self, which constitutes the essence of the organism, is done with, away with. And what really happens here is that the attempted comparison of inner and outer is transferred to inorganic nature. Here the infinite notion is only the essence which is concealed within or falls without in self-consciousness, and no longer, as in the organism, is objectively present. This relation of inner and outer has thus still to be considered in its own proper sphere. In the first place, that inner aspect of shape as the simple singularity of an inorganic thing is specific gravity. As a simple being, it can be observed just as well as the determinateness of number, of which alone it is capable, or, strictly speaking, it can be found by comparing observations, and it seems in this way to give one aspect of the law. Shape, colour, hardness, toughness, and a countless host of other properties would together constitute the outer aspect, and would have to give expression to the determinateness of the inner, namely number, so that the one would have its counterpart in the other. Now, because negativity is understood here not as a movement of the process, but as a unity brought to rest, or as a simple being for self, it appears rather as that by which the thing resists the process and inwardly preserves itself as indifferent towards it. But in virtue of the fact that this simple being for self is a tranquil indifference toward another, specific gravity appears as one property alongside others, and with that all necessary relation of it to this plurality, in other words, all conformity to the law, ceases. Specific gravity as this simple inner does not have the moment of difference within itself. In other words, the difference it has is only unessential, for it is just its pure simplicity that effaces all essential distinction. Thus, this unessential difference, magnitude, must therefore have its counterpart or other in the other aspect, namely the plurality of properties, since it is only through this that it is difference at all. If this plurality itself is concentrated into the simplicity of the antithesis and determined, say, as cohesion, so that this cohesion is a being for self in others, just as specific gravity is a pure being for self, then this cohesion is in the first place pure determinateness posited in the notion, in contrast to that other determinateness, and the way of formulating the law would be that which we considered above, in connection with the relation of sensibility to irritability. In the next place, cohesion, qua notion of being for self in others, is further only the abstraction of the abstract aspect standing over against specific gravity, and in such has no existence, for being for self in others is the process in which the inorganic would have to express its being for self as a self-preservation which would secure it from emerging from the process as moment of a product. But this is contrary to its nature, which has no purpose or universality in it. Its process, rather, is merely the specific activity in which its being for self, i.e. its specific gravity, is suspended. But this specific activity itself, in which its cohesion would exist in its true notion, and the specific gravity of its specific gravity, the specific quantity of its specific gravity, are notions completely indifferent towards each other. If the way in which they react to each other is left out of the account, and attention is confined to the idea of quantity, we could perhaps think of the determination like this, that a greater specific weight as a more intense being within self would resist involvement in the process more than would a smaller specific weight, but conversely the freedom of being for self only proves itself in the case with which it enters into relation with everything and preserves itself in this multiplicity. The said intensity without extension of relation is an empty abstraction, for extension constitutes the outer existence of intension, but the self-preservation of the inorganic in its relation falls, as we have noted, outside of its nature, since the inorganic does not contain within itself the principle of movement, or, in other words, because its being is not absolute negativity and notion. This other aspect of the inorganic, on the other hand, when considered not as a process but as a quiescent being, is ordinary cohesion, a simple sensuous property standing over against the liberated moment of otherness which is separated into a number of mutually indifferent properties and which, like specific gravity, is one of these properties. The multiplicity of properties together, then, constitutes the other aspect of cohesion. In this, however, as in the other properties, number is the sole determinant, and this not only does not express a relation between these properties and a transition from one to another, but is essentially just the absence of any necessary relation, and it represents rather the abolition of all conformity to law, for it is the expression of a determinateness that is unessential. This being so, then a series of bodies in which the difference is expressed as a numerical difference of their specific gravities by no means runs parallel to a series in which the difference is that of the other properties, even if, to facilitate the comparison, only one or some of them are taken, for as a matter of fact only the entire bundle of properties could constitute the other series in such a parallel. To bring this into order and bind it into a whole, observation has at its disposal, on the one hand, the quantitative determinateness of these various properties. On the other hand, however, their differences are manifest as qualitative. Now, in this heap of properties, what would have to be characterized as positive or negative, and as mutually cancelling each other in general, the internal arrangement and exposition of the formula, which would be a very complicated matter, this would be for the notion to determine. But the notion is excluded by the very manner in which the properties are immediately there and taken up. In this mere being of the properties, none displays the character of a negative over against the other. On the contrary, one is just as well as the other is, nor does it indicate in any other way its place in the arrangement of the whole. In the case of a series which progresses with parallel differences, whether the relation is meant to be one of simultaneous increase on both sides, or of increase only on one and decrease on the other, what is of interest is only the final simple expression of this combined whole, which was supposed to constitute one aspect of the law over against specific gravity, but this one aspect, as a given result, is precisely nothing else than what has already been mentioned, viz., a single property, say like ordinary cohesion, alongside which the indifferent others, specific gravity among them, are found, and each of the others can with equal right, that is, with equal incorrectness, be taken as representative of the entire other side. The one, like the other, would merely represent, in German, Vorstellung, the essential nature, but would not itself be that essential nature, so that the attempt to find series of bodies which would run simply parallel to each other and would express the essential nature of the bodies according to a law of these two series must be regarded as a conception that is ignorant of its task and of the means whereby it should be carried out.